is now being recorded.
Welcome to this training on how to report your activities funded by the Violence Against Women Act. This training is presented by the Violence Against Women Act Measuring Effectiveness Initiative, or VAWA-MEI, at the Muskie School of Public Service. We are a national technical assistance provider for VAWA grantees, and we are responsible for analyzing grantee-reported data for the Office on Violence Against Women, or OVW. This training is for grantees with a disability grant. That would be the education, training, and enhanced services to end violence against and abuse of women with disabilities. For short, during this training, we will just call it the disability grant. Grantees are required to report on their activities every 6 months using this semi-annual progress reporting form. The January through June reporting period has a report that is due on July 30th. For the July through December reporting period, the progress report is due on January 30th. The progress reports are always due into the Grants Management System, or GMS, 30 days after the close of the reporting period. First off, we would like to thank you for accessing this training. We hope that this training enables you to provide the most detailed and accurate reporting for your grant-funded work on your semi-annual progress report. Accurate data reporting is so important for many reasons. Your quantitative and qualitative data enable VAWA's effectiveness to be measured. VAWA-MEI creates reports for OVW using your data and data from grantees all across the country. These summary data reports support OVW to make requests for increased appropriations and to defend VAWA's budget to decision makers. Your data also helps OVW to make sure that federal funds are being spent appropriately and to measure the performance of grant programs. Additionally, every 2 years, the Attorney General is required to submit a report to Congress on the overall effectiveness of VAWA funding. VAWA grantee data makes up a significant part of that mandated report. So the more consistently that grantees fill out their reports, the more accurately VAWA's effectiveness can be measured through these means. Before we begin, I want to draw your attention to the screen in front of you, which is a split screen. For this training, on the right-hand side of the screen, we will use the progress reporting form. We'll scroll through question by question and talk about how to answer each of the questions on the form. On the left-hand side of the screen, you have informational slides. A few tips before we start talking about the form. There are separate instructions which are available on our website for download. The separate instructions go question by question through the form and are very helpful with examples to assist you in filling out the form. Throughout the form, there are other categories listed for many questions. In general, we ask that you use this other category only if you can't find a category of close fit for the information that you wish to report. When we aggregate the data for reports, the responses in the other category often do not get included in those reported totals. However, there are some cases where we recognize that you need to use that other category in order to accurately report the data that you have. That is fine, and we understand that. We ask that you be specific whenever you do report in the other category, but also that you take the time to rule out all of the other existing categories first. If there is a close fit, please feel free to use it. If not, then feel free to use the other categories. If you don't need to use that other category, you can just leave it blank. You don't need to report NA, not yet, or not applicable, or anything like that. Following most sections on the form, you will also find optional narrative questions. Use these sections to talk about the unique successes of your grant-funded activities. Talk about the impact that grant-funded activities have made in your community or for survivors. These questions exist at the end of each section so that you can provide more detail about the work that's being done in each area, and you can tell a story behind the hard data. We encourage you to report in those optional narrative questions to better capture the work that you're doing with your grant funds. So tell us a story there. We ask that you try not to use acronyms or abbreviations in your data. If you do need to use an acronym, please spell it out for us every single time that you use it. Do not send attachments or other documents that contain any data that you wish for us to see. We will never get them. Only data that is contained in this reporting form will be received and analyzed by Muskie's VAWA-MEI. So please try to fit everything that you need to tell us about your data into the form itself. And finally, if you're struggling, if you have questions, please feel free to give us a call or send us an email. We are here to help. We're technical assistance providers, and we really look forward to working with you in this process of data reporting. So now we're going to get started with the form. The general grant information on the first page that you'll be reporting, part of it will come pre-populated when you download this form out of GMS. The first question is the date that you're submitting your report. The second question is the period that you are reporting, whether that's January through June or July through December, and the year. Your grantee name and number should already be pre-populated when you download the form. Check to make sure that it is correct. If it's not, please contact GMS to make sure that you have the appropriate form or to get that information corrected. Question 5 asks what type of funded organization you are. So check the appropriate box, and then whether or not you are faith-based, and what phase of your grant you are in, whether the planning and development phase or the implementation phase of your grant. Question 6 asks for a point of contact. This is the person that is most familiar with the day-to-day activities that are being funded by the disability grant. So please make sure that that person has their contact information here. This is also the person that we will contact should we have any questions about your data. In question 7, if your grant specifically addresses tribal populations, please list the specific tribes and nations. Question 8 is up to your estimation. How many of your resources or your staff time or your grant funds are being devoted to each of these areas: sexual assault, domestic violence or dating violence, or stalking? So this is at your discretion how you would estimate your grant funds are being used. Now we're going to come to our next section, staff. If your grant funds are supporting staff, then check yes. And we're going to talk a little bit about how do you report staff using full-time equivalents, or FTEs. So this form is only capturing grant-funded activities, so remember that we are only capturing the grant-funded staff. And that would be staff whose salary is partially or fully funded by the disability grant, staff that are part-time or full-time, contractors or consultants that have been paid with disability grant funds. All of this can be reported using FTEs. FTEs are decimals, not percentages. So we'll talk about how to convert your staff time into FTEs, and we always report to the second decimal point. We also recognize that in your organizations, many people probably wear multiple hats, and that's understandable, and we can still capture their activities using FTEs, which we will break apart across the categories of the functions that those staff people are actually doing. So you want to always report by the activity or the function that is being performed rather than the job title, because the job title may not really describe what the person is doing. So if one staff member or all staff members are falling into more than one category, then you can divide their FTEs across those categories. Time should also be prorated if necessary. When somebody is part-time or was hired partway through a grant period or is partially funded, then that person's time needs to be prorated for whatever the disability grant paid of their time. Also, you'll see that you do have an other category in this section. We ask that you only use it if you absolutely need to and there's not a category of close fit. And so if you do need to use it, please give us the corresponding FTE of anybody that you do put into the other category. So here is a helpful sheet for calculating FTEs. So when we calculate FTEs, we're thinking about 1,040 working hours in a 6-month reporting period. So if you're full-time and fully funded, that's how many hours you might have worked. And so we're going to use that number to calculate people that might have worked less than that, and we need to prorate their FTEs. So if somebody is fully funded under the grant and working full-time at 40 hours a week for 6 months out of the whole period, then that is 1 FTE. If somebody is working part-time, say they're working 20 hours a week, but they're fully funded under the grant, that would be half an FTE, or 0.50. If somebody is working less than that, for example, a contractor or consultant who might have billed you for hours, say you got invoices for 104 hours during that reporting period, then you would take that 104 hours and you would divide it by the 1,040 total possible working hours in that period. And that equation would give you 0.10, and that will be your FTE for somebody who is working a smaller amount of hours, we just use that number of hours and divide it by the total possible working hours, 1,040 for the FTE. So now we're going to do a few examples. And so you can turn to the progress report on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can take a look at how we've reported these staff. So for example, your organization is funding one full-time disability advocate whose salary is 45% funded by the grant, and another full-time disability advocate whose salary is 50% funded by the grant. So we have two full-time disability advocates, but their salaries are only partially covered by the grant. So what we're going to do is take their percentages, 45 and 50, convert those into the FTE decimal of 0.45 and 0.50, and then we'll add them together because it's the same staff category that we are reporting even though it's two people. So 0.45 plus 0.50 gives us 0.95 FTE, and we're going to put that into the disability advocate category. Our next example is that our organization is also funding a full-time employee who spent 16 hours a week coordinating the program and 24 hours a week training professionals in the field and holding community education events. So this person is wearing two hats. They may have one job title, but we're not going to report using that job title. We're going to report them by their functions. So 16 hours a week is 40% of their time. And so they're doing program coordination for that part of their time. 24 hours a week is 60% of their time. And so that part of their time is being spent doing training and education. So we already know that our two categories that we need to put them in are program coordinator and trainer. So the FTEs associated with those two functions are going to be the percentages of their time converted to an FTE decimal. So program coordinator is going to be 0.40 and trainer is going to be 0.60. And the way that we arrived at that is taking that 16, dividing it by 40, that gives us 40%, and then taking the 24 and dividing that by the 40 hours a week, and that gives us 60%. So that's how I arrived at those decimal points. Our organization is also funding a full-time victim advocate who was hired 3 months into the reporting period. So with this person, we need to prorate their time because they have not been with us for the full reporting period. So our reporting period, we're always thinking in terms of 6 months. That is the reporting period for everybody in all times. So this person has only worked 3 months out of that period. So because they're full-time, that means that they would be one whole FTE if they had been there all 6 months. But since they've only been there half the time, that drops them down to 0.5 FTE. And in the next reporting period, they may have been there for the whole 6 months because we assume that they will stay with us. And so next reporting period, we will probably see this person being reported as 1 FTE, but for this period, they're being reported as 0.5 FTE, and they're in the victim advocate category. So that is an example of prorating their time based on how long they've been with us. So if you have questions about staff, please do give us a call. We're happy to help you calculate FTEs. So I'm going to move us along to the next section, which is priority areas. So in this section, you want to check all of the appropriate categories that apply to your grant activities. So if you're not sure what your purpose areas are under your disability grant program, then you want to refer to your grant proposal or your award letter, or you can also reach out to your program specialist if you're not sure or if you want to change your priority areas. Moving us along to the next slide, planning and development activities. So if you are in your planning and development phase, you're going to fill out this section. If you're not in the planning and development phase anymore and you're in the implementation phase, then you're going to skip ahead and you would fill out the following sections, but not this one. So if this is the phase that you're in, then in question 11, you want to report the total number of people that are attending your planning and development meetings during this period. In question 12, you want to check all of the activities that were conducted in the planning and development phase and were supported by your disability grant. In question 13, You want to report the total number of planning and development meetings by frequency, daily, weekly, or monthly, and check the appropriate boxes to indicate if the agencies are your MOU partners or pilot sites. So this section is sort of like the Coordinated Community Response section, or the CCR section, for grantees in the planning phase. It provides a picture of the relationships that you have with other agencies and organizations for planning and development activities, and the frequency with which you have contact with them. In question 14, you want to report the total number of site visits that were conducted by an OVWTA provider and the total number of consultations that were conducted by an OVWTA provider. In question 15, we have an optional narrative box, and you can tell us more about the planning and development activities that you have been doing. Now moving along to the training section. So for starters, training is defined as activities for professionals or volunteers that are acting in the role of a professional to improve their response to victims and survivors as it relates to their role in the system. So that's the definition for training. And so training and education are different. Education is for community members. You'd be giving general information to community members to elevate their understanding and promote awareness of sexual violence. So you want to think about your audience here when you're deciding whether to report in the training section or the education section and who you put where. So thinking about your audience, if you're presenting to a group that is typically not seen as professionals that work with victims and survivors or offenders, then you should question whether you're providing training or whether you're doing community education. Additionally, training is not counting staff development. So there's not a place in this section to report staff development that you're doing for your own disability grant-funded staff. And so keep that in mind when you're reporting the professionals that you're training. You're not including grant-funded staff here. So we're going to do an example with the training section. You can turn to the right-hand side of our screen and look at the progress report and see how we've filled this example out. Our organization is supporting 10 trainings with grant funds for professionals during this reporting period. 2 of those included interpretive services. 4 additional training events were provided, but they were funded with other funding streams. So at these 10 events, 175 professionals attended the grant-funded training events. 45 professionals attended the training events that were done with other funds. So we have 10 training events that are supported by the Disability Grant Program. We're only going to report those 10. Nowhere are we going to report the 4 that were done with other funding streams. Those don't go anywhere on this form. So the 10 is going to go in question 16, the total number of training events that were provided. And the next box down, you want to put the 2 events which were including interpretive services. And then we're going to turn to question 17, where we report all of the people that we trained by profession. So it's really helpful if you keep sign-in sheets at all of your training events, because you need to report the professions of people that you trained in question 17. So here you will see that we broke apart the 175 professionals that were trained. Again, we're not reporting the 45 that were trained at non-grant funded training events. But the 175 professionals, we're reporting them by their discipline or by their profession here. So do remember to keep sign-in sheets. In question 18, you want to check all of the appropriate boxes next to the topics that you have trained on. And in question 19, there's space for additional information about the training activities that you were doing with grant funds. Next up is community education. So we just talked about training being for professionals, whereas community education is information that you're giving to community members, and this is general information, and we're hoping that it will increase public awareness of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So again, thinking about our audience, it helps us decide whether or not it's training or education. So if it's education, then we're going to report it in questions 20 and 21. In this example, our organization supported 17 educational events, 10 of which included interpretive service, and these were supported by grant funds. So we're going to report that in question 20. 17 education events, and 10 of these had interpretive services provided. Now, back to our example, 1,125 people attended the events, including community groups, deaf individuals, parents and guardians of individuals with disabilities, and people with disabilities. So we're still going to break apart these attendees by who they are in the community. So we're going to report by identity in question 21, who we educated. And so all of these will be automatically totaled for the 1,125 people at the bottom, similar to in the training section. And also similar to the training section, question 22 asks, what topics did you educate people on? So at these 17 different events, what were the topics that were covered? And then in question 23, we have space for additional information. Moving along to policies in section C4. So here you're going to report on policies and protocols which you developed with grant funds during this current reporting period. If a policy or protocol is still in the development phase or the revision phase, then don't report on it yet. Wait until next time when it's actually finished. And when we talk about policies and protocols that are being developed, substantially revised, or implemented, those words all implicate a significant amount of staff time being used. And so when you think about if you've revised a policy, that's not just minor changes. That means that you've spent significant time and resources in doing that. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're reporting the policies that you have developed, revised, or implemented. There's also a space for additional information about the policies and protocols that you have created and maybe the difference that they are making in your organization or to those that you're serving. Our next section, technical assistance, C5. So here you want to report on technical assistance activities. This is for implementation phase grantees. So technical assistance can be a wide variety of activities, and it's designed to facilitate individual or agency change in some systemic manner by providing expertise to solve a problem. So some examples of that might include clarifying legislative and policy implementation or standards of service, technology consultations, or assistance with problem solving. So if you are engaged in technical assistance, then you want to report the total number of activities that you provided with disability grant funds this period in the matrix in question 26. And so each consultation counts as one event when you're looking at the column that says number or other technical assistance consultations. So each consultation counts as one event. And then for the technical assistance that you are providing, check off all of the appropriate topics that you're covering. In question 28, if organizations have developed, revised, or implemented policies regarding accessibility or services for women with disabilities as a result of the TA that you are giving them, then you want to report that number here. And then any additional information that you have about the TA activities of your grant, talk about that in question 29. Moving on to section C6, coordinated community response. So with coordinated community response, we're looking at the agencies and organizations that you are working with in the community and partnering for this work. So in the first column, you'll see a pretty comprehensive list of agencies and organizations with whom you might be working. So in the first column, you're going to check off all of the organizations that apply if you have developed, revised, and implemented any training and education with them. In the next column, if you're collaborating with them in any way, then you would check that off there. And if you have a memorandum of understanding with them, if they are one of your MOU partners, you would check that off in the third column. Question 31 gives you an opportunity to tell us any additional information about the partnerships and collaborations in your community. You're doing your CCR activities here. Moving along to products. So if you have used disability grant funds to develop, revise, or distribute products, then you're going to report on that here. So again, similar to policies and protocols, the development, substantial revision, or distribution of products, this is where we're thinking that this is going to take significant staff time and resources. So really consider that when you're thinking about a product that you might have revised. If it's minor changes, that's not a substantial revision. If you have substantially revised it, then report on it in this period. Also, before you report on these products, and certainly before you distribute them, you do need to get them approved with your OVW program specialist. So in the first column, you have a listing of common products that disability grantees may be funding and distributing. And so if you are developing any of these products in this period, then you want to report the number that you have developed or revised in that first column. If you didn't develop it or revise it during this period, but you did so during a previous period, but you're still using it, you can still report on this product for the number that you used and distributed, but you would leave that first column blank for how many that you developed or revised because it was already developed and it was already revised. Then you would give us the title or topic and the intended audience of this product. And then you would tell us how many were distributed. So if you have created a product, but you haven't distributed it yet, then you want to leave that column blank. But if you have distributed it, then you want to tell us how many that you have distributed. What you will notice is there is not a place to report how many you have printed. Say you developed a brochure and you printed 100, but you only distributed 85. We only report the 85 that are distributed. And then you hang on to that remaining 15 that you didn't distribute, but you did print, and hopefully you'll be able to use those next period, and then you can report on them then. But nowhere is there a place to talk about how many you printed. It's just how many you actually distributed. And then if you had developed this product in an alternative format or another language, then you would tell us that in the final column there. Now I'm going to move us along to victim services. Next, I'm going to move us along to the victim services section. If you are using grant funds to serve victims and survivors in your community, then you want to report on those activities in Section D. So most of the data that's requested in this section is congressionally mandated. That means that Congress wants to know how many of the number of victims and survivors who were seeking services were served and how many could not be served. So you're providing information in this section that represents only those victims and survivors who were served under the disability program funding as well. And in question 33, we are asked to report on the total number of victims and survivors who were served, partially served, not served, and then by the category of their victimization. So when we're considering who to report here, then we're really thinking about three major questions. Are they accepting and requesting grant-funded services? Are you funded to provide these services? And are they a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking? So those are our primary guiding questions here. And now we're going to think a little bit about who is served, partially served, and not served. What does that mean? So you're going to count a victim as served if they requested grant-funded services and your program was able to provide all of those services. So here, what we're really after is, were they requesting services, and were those services funded by the disability grant? So those are the two really important things. You would count a victim as partially served if they requested grant-funded services, but because of programmatic issues, your program could not provide all of the services that were requested. If a victim is not served, that means that your program could not provide any of the services which were grant-funded and which they requested due to programmatic issues. So before we move on, I just want to take a moment to talk about partially served and not served victims and survivors. We find that grantees are often worried about reporting as partially served or not served because they fear that it will appear they're not meeting their goals or objectives and that it will shed a negative light on their program. However, by reporting victims as partially served or not served, grantees are actually helping OVW and policymakers to understand the scope and burden of violence that stretches far beyond what VAWA funding is able to respond to. OVW knows that VAWA funding is not enough to support every victim who requests services from grantees. Therefore, we want to encourage you to carefully track and report using both quantitative data and narrative data to highlight instances of partial or non-service. Narrative data can highlight long waiting lists for services, full emergency shelters, or a program's inability to support victims on family court days. So your more detailed data can help show the great need for services that exist. We also want to spend a minute thinking about who is not counted at all. So first of all, we're only thinking about grantees who are requesting grant-funded services. So if they're requesting services that are not funded under the disability grant, then we don't count them at all on this form. And those that did not accept any grant-funded services that were offered or recommended, those are also not counted at all. Say you are offering somebody a service, you see a need, you offer the service that is funded under the grant, but they are not accepting that service. They are not counted. I know the temptation is to report them in not served, but that would not be accurate for this progress reporting form purposes because they were not accepting or requesting grant-funded services. Also, we do not report secondary victims in this section, so we are only looking at primary victims of sexual assault, domestic violence and dating violence, or stalking. So if this is a secondary victim, then they don't belong in question 33. We're also looking for an unduplicated count of survivors, and so that means that we only count one individual one time during each reporting period that they are receiving services. If this is a continuous client and they have received services from you in the past and they were on progress reports in the past, they can still be on this progress report if they're still receiving services. However, you would only report them once in each period in which they are receiving services. So one example might be a victim requested counseling at the beginning of the reporting period, and then they came back at the end of the reporting period and requested language services. They should be reported only once in question 33, and then they would be counted under each service that you provided them with in question 37. So again, that's how we think about unduplicated count of individuals who are receiving service. Question 33 also asks us to disaggregate our victims and survivors by victimization. So I know that this can be a little bit difficult because some survivors may have multiple victimizations, and so you're really looking for their primary or presenting victimization. Whatever it is that is bringing them to your organization for services, that's the victimization that you would report in question 33. For example, a victim's estranged intimate partner who had a history of very controlling behavior came to her apartment and sexually assaulted her. She came to your agency looking for help with a protection order. So you could report her under the domestic violence or the sexual assault category, but you have to choose only one of those categories for the purposes of question 33 because we only want to count her once so we can get an unduplicated count. So in this example, the sexual assault category might be more appropriate because it was a sexual assault that really prompted her to seek your services, even though there was a history of domestic violence there too. Later on, there will be a place where we can capture those multiple victimizations or multiple offenders, but for question 33, we're only reporting each individual once. So now we're going to go through some examples that will help us to practice reporting in section D. A victim of domestic violence calls your program looking for crisis intervention and group support. Both of these services are funded by your disability grant, and you provide crisis intervention and she attends a support group. So in this case, the victim is receiving all the services that she's requesting, and all the services are grant-funded. So she is served. This victim should be reported as served in question 33, and we are going to put her in the domestic violence, dating violence column. Your program offers crisis intervention and court accompaniment under the disability grant. A victim of domestic violence asks for these two services, but your program can only provide crisis intervention because the advocate is busy on the day of the hearing. You help the victim to find a non-grant-funded advocate from another organization to accompany her to the hearing. So in this case, the victim is receiving some but not all of the requested services that are funded under your disability grant from you. Even though she's getting all the services, all of her needs are being met, they're not all being met by your organization because you referred her on to a different organization. So we are serving her with one of the two grant-funded services that she's asking for. And so that makes her partially served. And she's also going to go under the domestic violence or dating violence column. Finally, a woman is sexually assaulted and a police officer who responded to the incident has called your program's hotline on behalf of the victim, asking if an advocate will accompany her to the hospital during her exam. There's no advocate available to do this, and it is a service that is funded by your disability grant. So in this case, this person is not served. And so because you are unavailable to accompany her to the exam, the reason that we are going to report for not serving her in question 34 in our list of reasons for partially serving or not serving people would be that our program is unable to provide service due to limited resources or priority setting. And that's really the same reason as the person that was partially served in this example as well. So both our partially served victim or survivor and our not served victim or survivor, the reason for not serving was the program was unable to provide service due to limited resources or priority setting. And so when you're thinking about the reasons for anybody that was partially served or not served, this list in question 34 is pretty comprehensive. So if you're tempted to put something into the other category, read that list again because these really do catch a lot of scenarios. And if you are still tempted to put something in the other category, you may be thinking about somebody who really shouldn't be counted on this form. For example, somebody that was requesting a service that was not funded by the grant, or whether if somebody was requested services but then moved away, and so then they would not be counted on this form if they voluntarily withdrew themselves from asking for services. So read through this list a few times in question 34 when you're thinking about how to describe people that were not served or were partially served. So now our total number of people that were served or partially served in question 33. That total number is going to take us through the rest of this section. So in question 35, the form asks for demographics of those who were served and partially served. So the first category of demographics is race and ethnicity. Survivors can have more than one race or ethnicity, and so we recognize that the total here may be higher than the total from question 33, total served and partially served. And that is fine. However, when we get to gender and age, the total for these two demographic categories does need to equal the total number of served and partially served from question 33. So if somebody does not fit perfectly into the boxes, especially in the gender categories, then you can report the gender that most closely fits the gender with which they identify. And if you don't know, then there is an unknown box. And so we recognize that the categories provided are not exhaustive. So do your best to use the category of closest fit, and then feel free to tell us more about that in the narrative after the victim services section. For other demographics, people with disabilities, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people with limited English proficiency, or people that, who are immigrants, refugees, or asylum seekers, or living in rural areas. So you would report to the best of your knowledge in this section. As you find out about these things during service, you could report on these, but it's not something that you necessarily need to collect data on at intake. Question 36 is where we get to capture multiple victimizations. So this question is asking for the relationship between the victim and survivor and the offender. So in this section also you might report on our example where somebody had multiple offenders. You could count all of those offenders in this category, and additionally if there were multiple victimizations in same offender. So you would be able to count the different victimizations: sexual assault, domestic violence or dating violence, and stalking, and then the list of possible relationships in the first column. So that is where we capture multiple victimizations. In question 37, these are all of the services that you might be serving people with. And so, again, we're looking for an unduplicated count of victims and survivors in each category. We're not looking for the frequency with which you have provided these services. For example, somebody might have received counseling on a weekly basis for the whole 6-month reporting period, but we only count that individual once in the counseling section, in the counseling category. We don't count the frequency of those visits. We count them as one individual receiving counseling. But you would put them in every single category of service that they are receiving in question 37. If you are supporting shelter services, then here's the only place in the form where we can capture secondary victims. So the first column is for primary victims and survivors who are staying in emergency shelter or transitional housing. And then the next column over is family members that might be accompanying them in those shelters. The final column is for the total number of bed nights, and that includes both the primary victim and the accompanying family members. So if you have one person staying in transitional housing and she has 2 children staying with her, that's 3 people, and they stay for a month. So then we take the 30 nights times 3 people. That gives us a total of 90 total bed nights. Question 37C. You want to report all of the hotline calls that you have answered with disability grant funds, first from victims and survivors, and second, the total number of calls. Question 37D, victim witness notification or outreach to victims and survivors. Here is a place where we can capture the interactions between your organization and victims and survivors that didn't necessarily result in services. So a lot of the people that you didn't count in question 33 of who was served and partially served, if there were a lot of people that you had to not count because they weren't requesting grant-funded services, those might go in question 37D. So these might be unsolicited letters to victims and survivors. Maybe you send 30 letters and only 2 people come for services, or no people come for services. But you would be able to count those 30 unsolicited letters here in question 37D. Or say, a police officer at a domestic violence incident calls your agency and asks you to come to be with the victim in that incident, and so you show up, but the victim does not want your services. They refuse on site. And so that would still be an outreach to victims and survivors, and you would be able to count that here in question 37D, even though there was no, you were not serving anybody, you were doing outreach there. In question 38, if disability grant funds or funded staff are assisting victims and survivors in obtaining protection orders, then you would count that here, and again, we're going to break it apart by the presenting victimization of the victim or survivor that you're helping. And so even if the protection order itself isn't specific to these victimizations, the victim or survivor that you're helping, that would correspond to their victimization in question 33, whether they were under sexual assault, domestic violence, or stalking. And finally, at the end of this section, you have an optional narrative box, and you can tell us more information about the services that you are providing with disability grant funds, and the effectiveness, the impact, survivor stories, things like that can all go here. Also challenges, highlighting instances of non-service or partial service, that can all go in question 39. This narrative data is extremely helpful in painting a picture behind the raw data that you've just reported on in section D. So here we're really looking for the story behind the numbers. And then I'm going to move us along to our last section, a narrative. So in question 40, this question is really for your program specialist to do grant monitoring. And so you're going to talk about your grant goals and objectives and your status on those. In questions 41 and 42, these questions are looking at the remaining area of need in your community and also what your disability grant fund has been able to do because of this funding that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So 41 and 42 sort of go together. So when you're thinking about the remaining areas of need in your community for question 41, you can sort of lift up your focus and paint with a broader brush. This is not just have to be about activities that you were funded to do under the disability grant. You can broaden the outlook here to talk about needs that you still see in your community that are not being met. And then in question 42, you can talk about the needs that you have been able to meet because you have this funding and you couldn't have done that without the funding. And then in question 43, this is basically spillover for about how effective has your grant funding been. You can talk more about effectiveness here in question 43. And then in question 44, you can tell us about any data irregularities, glitches with the form, anything that might stand out to us here at VAWA MEI that we might have questions about your data. You can preempt us asking you that question by just telling us about it in question 44. And then that brings you to the end of the form. So then we get to talk about validating. So once you have entered all of your data in this form, great job, go to the last page and you want to click the validate button. So this is just checking all of the sections in the form, and it's looking for any errors before you submit. And so you might get one of 3 messages. If you get the big red X, then that's telling you that there is data somewhere in your report, and it's going to tell you what section on that little error message that you need to go back and fix before you can submit it. And so you can just click yes, and it will take you right back to the section on the form that is saying this is not, either you've left information out, it's incomplete, or you have made an error that the form is detecting. So fix that and then come back and press validate again. And then you might get a soft warning, and this is the yellow exclamation point warning. And so this is just a soft warning that's saying you might want to go and check this out. It looks like something might not be right. So you go and you check it out, and if it is right, then you can go and validate, and you will be able to do that successfully. But it might also be alerting you to something that you didn't mean to report, and so you can make that change and then go back down to the bottom and validate. So hopefully by the end, you will get the message that says your form has been successfully validated and is ready for submission. At that point, you can submit this into GMS. Great job. So before we conclude today, just want to draw your attention to our website and resources that are available to you there. There are sample progress reporting forms and instructions. Sample progress reporting forms like the one that you see on the right-hand side of this screen, and also the instructions that go along with each form. So those can be really helpful tools as you go about the progress reporting period and collect the data that you're going to need to report on. There will also be training dates and training materials there where you can attend a live webinar training with us. There are also reports that are created with grantee data, such as the final report to Congress, the biennial report to Congress, or the stop report to Congress. You can download those and see what people are saying about your data and with your data to Congress. And then there are summary data reports, and so these are program specific, so you can look at the disability grant program data in 6-month increments. So at the end of each reporting period, with all of the grantee data aggregated, we create summary data reports, and those may be interesting to you to see what other grantees in your grant program are doing. And finally, I want to leave you with our contact information and remind you that we are a technical assistance provider, and we love hearing from grantees, and we are looking forward to working with you and partnering you in this process of reporting your funded activities and data. So you can contact us at the Muskie School, and you can also reach out to your program specialist at OVW, for example, if you need products to be approved, if you have questions about your purpose areas, then you can reach out to them at OVW. And if you're having technical difficulties with the form or with GMS, then please reach out to GMS support. And thank you so much for being with us for this training. I hope that it was helpful.